Hi folks, my name is Curtis Poe, better known to most of you as Ovid, and I'm here to talk about bringing modern object-oriented programming to the Perl programming language. And this is the Corinna status update. Corinna is the name of the project. And this is for the 2022 Perl conference in Houston, Texas. And I want to apologize. I said I was going to be there, but I'm not there because my passport is not here. It's very embarrassing, and I want to apologize tremendously to all of you, and especially to the conference committee for all the hard work they've done. And this was a terrible thing to happen at the last moment. I also want to say thank you to the sponsors for the conference, cPanel and Grant Street Group. If you're looking for a great Perl job for great companies, please check both of them out. They're just fantastic people. I've met quite a number of them. They're lovely. As we get into this particular talk, I want to start with a dedication, though, to three very important members of the Perl community who are no longer with us, unfortunately. Most of you are familiar with David Adler and Jeff Goff. Both of them passed away tragically, relatively recently, and I consider both of them dear friends of mine. And it's very unfortunate, but it's happened. You may not know Sparky, real name Daniel Avila. He's not an important member of the Perl community to most of you, but he is to me. He was actually a Pythonista and a very good one. Companies kept calling him back because he was awesome at delivering, a brilliant individual. He passed away recently from cancer, unfortunately, complications due to cancer. And the reason he's important to me as a member of the Perl community is he's the man who taught me Perl, and I wouldn't be here were it not for him. So Sparky, wherever, whatever you are, and you and David and Jeff, if you're out there somewhere, I wish you the best. So I'm very sorry you're not with us anymore. So what is Corinna? You can find it at github.com/ovid/core. Core was the original name, short for Corinna. A lot of people thought that was too confusing with the name of the core language, so we changed it to Corinna. This talk is not going to be a tutorial about Corinna. I'll produce that for another talk at some point. This is actually a brief introduction to some of the concepts and the driving influences behind bringing modern object-oriented programming to Perl. But I want to talk about something called the Lisp curse. Many of you are probably familiar with this. If you're not, hit your favorite search engine, type it in there, Lisp curse. It will probably be the first hit in the search list. And I'm going to change it a little bit to the Perl curse because it's the same thing. Basically, because it is so easy to create object systems in Perl, of wide variety of object systems, that plenty of developers do it. And they tend to follow a scratch and niche model. These are the things that I want to fix. These are the things I want out of an OOP system, which don't necessarily fit what other people need. So they tend to solve like 80% of the problems that they have. The Pareto 20-80 rule, 20% of the effort solves 80% of the work. And that last 20% of the work is a pain. Trust me, I've been doing this. It is hard. So we have a wide variety of OOP systems for the Perl language. And all of them are built on two things. One, bless, and two, is up. That's it. That's all you get for OOP in core Perl. Just those two things. It's the assembly language of object-oriented programming, unfortunately. And I programmed in assembly before. I don't want to do it anymore. Bless basically says we have methods available. And ISA says where those methods are. That's obviously an oversimplification, but you get the rough idea. But actually, they don't talk about methods, they talk about subroutines, because Perl doesn't understand the difference between them. They're just subroutines with a kind of funky calling syntax, and that causes some of its own problems, which we won't even go into now. But this is core Perl today, core OOP in Perl. There's a lot of scaffolding, a lot of things you have to wire together in order to make it work properly. And if you're familiar with any of my past work with the Perl language, I hate the scaffolding. I hate a lot of the boilerplate. I do everything I can to make it go away because I don't want to focus on wiring everything together. I want to focus on building things, building beautiful things. And that's hard to do when I'm spending so many times wiring things together, and sometimes I get the wiring wrong. So this particular class, all it does, it's a name class. If you have a name, you can have a name, you can have an optional title, and if you print that out, down here, you can see we have name for Ovid is Ovid, name for doctor is Doctor Who. That's exactly what you're looking for. That's all the behavior you want, but that's a lot of stuff you got to write for that. and making sure that you get it all right. But this is what it looks like in Corinna. Just to give you a very simple example, there's a lot more to Corinna that I won't even be touching today. We declare our class name. We declare the two fields for our class, the name and the title. Each of them is a param, which means it's a parameter to the constructor. And the title has that postfix block saying, here's the default value if it's not in the constructor, which means title is actually optional, but the name parameter is not optional because we didn't provide a default for it. And then we have the method name, and that's a true method, I might add, and it works just fine. And it's much clearer, much easier to read, much easier to write, because you can focus on writing what you intend to write rather than wiring the bits together. But let's look at this really quick. You can see right here, our title has been misspelled. This is not an error in core OO Perl. In fact, this is not even a warning. Instead, this code simply doesn't do what you intended it to do. And those are hard bugs to track down, particularly when you have huge systems and you're wondering why this tiny little bit of a system way over there isn't doing exactly what you wanted. In Corinna, if I misspell the title field, well, that's a lexical variable. That's a compile time error. No more hunting down those bugs. It's going to fail for you at compile time. We've worked very hard to bring you a lot of these benefits through some design choices. Some are mine, some are from other people, and they work very well together. But when I mentioned that scratch and itch model, so many developers trying to write their own OOP systems because it's so easy to do in Perl, we've got over 80 of them on the cPanel. And it depends upon what you define as an OOP system. Some of these might not qualify, some of these do. They're all over the map. Many of them provide radically different capabilities. But two of them I've highlighted. I know it's hard to see because I tried to pack a lot in this slide, but Dios and Zydeco. Why are those particularly interesting to me? So Dios was created by Damian Conway. And if you look at it, you realize that it's heavily inspired by Raku. And he's done a lot of brilliant work behind the scenes to actually make this work. And then we have Zydeco by Toby Inkster. This is also another great OOP system, and you can see it's heavily influenced by Moose. And that one actually, ironically, uses some of the tools that Damian Conway used to build Dios. Why are they so interesting to me, though? Because one of the problems I see with many of the OOP systems we have out there today is they're trying to build on top of Perl and being restricted by its limitations. And Damian Conway and Toby Inkster said, I don't want to be restricted by those limitations. I want to build something great. And they did. Unfortunately, they tend to be a bit slow. And they have enough stuff packed into them that they might be intimidating to people. And they have radically different philosophies in some respects about how you're actually going to build your objects. This is Corinna. This is a more extensive example. I know there's a lot of stuff on the slide. I'm going to try and reduce that down in future slides. This is a simple LRU cache, least recently used. Basically, the least recently used items in your cache are the items you're going to keep, and anything which exceeds the cache size is going to get flushed out. Very popular caching strategy because it's very easy to implement. It doesn't take up too much memory. You can control the cache size easily. MySQL uses it. It's used all over the place. And this is fairly simple, fairly clean. I'm pretty happy with this example. But how did we get here? How did we get to the point of actually being able to build a prototype like this? Well, first of all, my work on this has been sponsored by All Around the World, allaroundtheworld.fr. That's who I work for. If you're interested in top-class consulting in Perl or a variety of other languages, we've worked with Vue.js, React, Python, tons of things. Come to us, talk to us, see what we can do for you. Paul Evans, I've been the lead designer of Corinna. Paul Evans has contributed to design. He's also the implementer of most of this. And he has several companies sponsoring his work. And I find this fascinating because the companies so badly want a modern, usable OO system in Perl that they're willing to shell out cold hard cash. And I think that's great. That says a lot of wonderful things about, Perl in the business world today. But I mentioned I was a lead designer of Corinna. So there's actually a fairly large team behind it. Large depends upon your viewpoint. These are not everyone who's been involved. These are some of the major contributors: Damian Conway, Dan Book, Graham Knopp, Harold Jorg, Matt Trout, Paul Evans, Sawyer, Stephen Little. There's been a lot of work from a lot of different people to get this thing being where we need it to be. And the history of this is rather interesting. So Stephen Little released the Moose 0.1 prototype in 2006. 1.0 didn't come out until almost exactly 4 years later. It took him a long time to make sure that he got it in the right spot, because it turns out building OO systems is hard. Making them work is hard. And he spent a lot of time doing this. But Moose is pretty big. It's got a lot of stuff packed in there. And it's not as fast as raw OO in Perl. So Stephen was working on this for a long time. He said, I want to bring modern OO to the Perl core. And how am I going to do this? And he eventually came up with this idea called Moxie, which I'll be talking about more in a bit. And he released that about 7 years after he released Moose. He likes Moose, obviously, but he wants even better. He doesn't want to rest on his laurels, so to speak. But Stephen has a lot of other things going on in his life, and he'd worked so long and so hard in bringing OO systems to Perl that he stopped. And I wanted modern OO in Perl, but I was just waiting for someone else to do it. I just assumed someone would. And so that's my bad. If I wanted something bad enough, I should work to make it happen. So in 2009, I decided I was going to work to make it happen. I was pretty sure it wasn't going to get accepted, but I was going to give it a try. And then shortly after that, met Sawyer at a Riga Perl conference, and he blew my mind. I'll get to that. And then shortly after that was the first public announcement of Corinna, which wasn't in the shape I wanted it to be, but it turns out it was a great announcement. A lot of people positively responded to it. And then Paul Evans immediately started working on Object Pad, saying, I can implement some of that. That's not too hard. And it's just taken off from there. So this is the point class. That's just an XY point class. That's all it is. XY point. My point's at 3, 7, whatever. That's still a lot of boilerplate, a lot of wiring together you have to do to make it work. In Corinna, we just declare our fields and we declare our clear method. That's it. It's simple. It's easy. And I think that's very important for us. So when I first started on Corinna, I was using keyword declare to implement this. And I had an implementation and test suite. My intent was, once I got it to a point that I felt it was comfortable, I was going to go to P5P, the Perl 5 porters, and say, here's a test suite. Here's a specification. If you can implement this in the core Perl language, all you have to do is make the test suite pass. And it was heavily influenced by Moxie ideals, and a lot of work from Moose. But again, I wasn't entirely comfortable with what they were doing, so I was trying to push it further. But then Sawyer X showed up at the 2019 Riga conference, and he saw what I was doing, and he said, don't do that. He said, don't focus on the implementation. Focus on the design. We have people on P5P who, if we get the design accepted, they're going to be able to implement this for you. Design something great. That changed my entire attitude about that. And what came out of that, my early work, was so much better than my earliest implementation. So this is what the cache LRU class looked like in the very first version that I announced to the world. It's not where it needs to be. It's still too heavily influenced by Moose, but that's where my mindset was at the time. It had a much cleaner syntax. Self was a keyword instead of a variable. Methods and subroutines were disambiguated finally. It had encapsulation by default, but I messed up the design on that, to be honest. There was no declarative way to expose state. That was a terrible mistake on my part. And I thought about using lexical variables to hold the instance data, but I thought, well, that comes from Raku, and maybe people are going to think it's too unperlish. I was wrong, and Paul Evans pointed that out, and we talked about it a bit, and he was definitely right. And I'm so grateful for that change, because that is what really helped get the ball rolling for finalizing the design to get it to where it needs to be, which is this, the cache LRU class. By the way, this class in Moose looks like this. I had to shrink the slide down. It's not too bad, but there's still a bit of wiring we have to do in order to put it together. Very frustrating. But not everyone has been happy with the Corinna project, and they've raised some objections, which are very fair objections. And I just want to address those up front, because I don't have the time to take questions from you, because this is a video, so I just want to get these out of the way. People say Bless is good enough for me. They say Moose or Moo1, they should be in the core. That's the most popular object frameworks for Perl today. Some have said, this is the same idea, it's just different syntax. There's nothing new here. And another objection, how can I debug an encapsulated object? I just can't call data dumper, it's not going to show me anything. And we're so used to being able to do that. So let's deal with those. If bless is good enough for you, that's fine, use it. We're not removing bless. We're not trying to change the language, we're adding to it. So if you want to have a blessed object, that's fine. Not only are we not intending to take away bless, even if we wanted to, we couldn't, because there's so many object systems out there today which require bless in their underpinning, so we can't take that away. So if you like bless, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And sometimes you do want to bless a reference which isn't a hash, for example. You might want to bless a regular expression or something like that. Don't worry about it. We're not taking it. Moose 1, they should be in the core. The very simple answer for that is P5P said no. So that's it. P5P says we're not putting them in the core. There's too much for them to maintain. It's too much of a hassle. They don't want to do that. And the authors of Moose and Moose, Stephen Little and Matt Trout, have said they have not advocated for them being in the core, as far as I'm aware. So that's just not going to happen. And if you argue for something that is not going to happen, even if you're right, it's not an effective argument. So we're going to skip that. Current limitations of Perl. This is something which most of the object systems out there today have. Methods and subroutines are the same thing. Classes and packages are the same thing. You don't have native state. You've got to try and figure out how to wire it together, which is really fun if you're trying to make sure that it works under threads, stuff like that. We don't have native encapsulation. There are some workarounds you can do for that class, inside-out objects, which have not been terribly popular and historically have been a bit buggy. We don't have native delegation. There's no difference between class and instance methods. Classes aren't first-class types. This is kind of just a big hack in the Perl language, and we can't really distinguish between the two. It would be nice to know that a reference is an object and not just trying to figure out if it's a blessed reference or whatever. It's frustrating, and we could go on and on, but we're trying to get beyond that right now. But this one I thought was curious. Same idea as different syntax. If you want a really interesting object system, start studying Alan Kay. The Dr. Alan Kay, he created the term object-oriented syntax. Object-oriented programming. He is more familiar with objects than most people have ever been, and he understands them intimately. And for him, it's about message passing. That's the key thing that he wants. And he wants extreme late binding. He doesn't want encapsulation, he wants isolation. I'm not going to go into all of that. If you want to know what that is, you're actually talking about a service-oriented architecture or microservices. The difference between the two depends upon who you ask, to be honest. But not only did that seem like a bridge too far for me because it was going to be too alien to Perl developers, it's also, I wasn't clear how I'd be implementing that in just Perl. So I'm taking something very familiar to Perl developers, I'm adding a few new things to it, and the team has put together something that it's going to be comfortable to you and not too alien, but it is not just the same ideas with different syntax. So we've been explaining the difference for years, but you can't just point people to RFC and say, go read the RFC, because RFC is huge, and a lot of people, they're not going to take the time to read it because there's a lot of stuff packed in there. But this is important, so I'm going to cover some of the highlights. Corinna is based upon decades of personal object-oriented programming experience on my part. And both Stephen Little and Matt Trout, the respective creators of Moose and Moo, are on board with the project and have supported it. It's supported by Damien Conway, who's the designer of Raku and the spec OOP systems. And I've just read plenty of books, papers, and articles about object-oriented programming to make sure that I was really understanding. Even I felt I was comfortable, but this has really taken my knowledge even much farther to get something that would fit Perl, but also kind of respect best practices and make it easier to do the right thing, because right now Perl makes it much easier to do the wrong thing, which is unfortunate. But I wanted to be Perlish. That was my number one goal. It had to feel not alien to Perl developers, because if you want to write in another language, other languages are out there. They're fine, they're great. But if you like Perl, you want something which feels like Perl. And I also had 2 DMC takedown notices by an OnlyFans artist named Corinna. So that was really fun to deal with. So let me explain this again. I don't have the time to go through all this. Chris Prather, known to most of you as Peregrin, wrote a brilliant email to P5P in response to someone saying, why don't you just take Perl and just gradually mutate it a step at a time until you get where you want to go? And a long, huge email in response to this when he broke down all of the problems currently in Perl and why we can't get there from here. And I'm not going to cover it right now, but it was absolutely brilliant. If you take the time to look for it, it is just a marvelous email. And I think it really helped to shift some of the tide on the thinking of some of the P5P people. The way I would explain this is Perl and Corinna, they're not topologically equivalent. You can't just push and twist modern Perl to get to Corinna. There's also the problem that because Corinna is kind of a radical shift, it's going to be the biggest change to the Perl language probably in about 3 decades. It has so many differences with Perl that and it takes some things away too, like we're going from multiple inheritance to single inheritance and using roles instead, that you would be adding a little bit and then you'd be taking stuff away and adding a bit and then taking stuff away and then adding a bit and taking stuff away. We would never get done. And we would be frustrating people the entire time we went there. And that is not a good thing. So it's an all or nothing approach. We are in. So Corinna gives you native composition. This is a beautiful thing. I've got this field cache where it defaults to a hash ordered object, and now I can just call the methods on that. It's all clean, it's easy, I don't have to wire anything together, try and figure out how to make that work. And part of the reason why native composition works so easily in Corinna, by the way, we're eventually going to add a handles attribute for fields so that you can have that delegation exposed to the outside world if you want to. One person asked, why didn't you inherit from hash ordered? Because you prefer composition over inheritance. If I inherited from hash ordered, I'd be exposing a lot of behavior that I don't want to expose. Hash ordered is just my underlying engine in this simple example of creating a simple cache. That's it. So composition over inheritance is a great thing. And the composition works so easily here because we have native state. The field cache is kind of like saying my $cache, except this field is instance data for each instance of your object. And it's native, and we can call methods directly on that. And we can access our data directly. We don't have to go through methods. The state is just automatically provided for you. You don't have to figure out how to do it. And it's native encapsulation because it's not exposed outside of the object. If you can see this, field max size param reader, the reader attribute, that says, okay, we're going to provide a method called max size to the outside world. So you can expose this data if you want to. You can also declare writers if you want it to be mutable. It's all there for you, but by default, you have to opt in to making your class interface larger. You don't opt out. And runtime failures are so frustrating. So, cache LRU written in Moose. Down here, you can see we have self cache, but I've misspelled cache. That becomes a runtime failure. And if you didn't write your tests well enough, or heaven forbid you didn't write tests at all, you might not catch that until it goes into production. And that's not fun. Here it is in Corinna. I've misspelled it. That's a compile time failure. So in Corinna, many times you have issues like this, or in Moose and Moo and Core Perl, you have many times where you have little errors like this in defining your state, where it could be a runtime failure, or it might just produce a warning, or it might not produce a warning at all and just silently not work. Because we've chosen to use lexical variables in Corinna, you get compile time failures if those aren't defined for you. So it's going to be a huge win for development. And as mentioned, fields are no longer exposed by default. You have to explicitly put this reader here to say, okay, we're going to have a max size method. Basically, the method name is the name of the variable, $max size, without the sigil in the front. But you can also pass an argument to the reader saying, okay, I want to expose this as a reader, but here's a different method name for it to make it. So you can use a different name for the variable from how you expose it to the outside world if you prefer. And a Moose and Moo, by default, everything declared with has is available in the constructor. And quite often you don't want that. You might have something that you do not want passed in the constructor because you can't trust it. So, or people just forget about init arg undef, or they don't even know about it, which means because they've exposed everything, they've made their interface a lot larger than they needed to, or it's a hassle to type init arg undef all the time. For Corinna, you have to explicitly state param. This is available to be passed into the constructor, so if I want the size of my cache to be larger, I could do so. So again, it is opt-in, not opt-out. By the way, if you talk to anyone who works in computer security, they will tell you that is the way to go. You want to be explicit about your intent, not just implicit in the hope that it works. And methods are not subroutines. So here's an example where I have imported a set function from some module, and then I have a method called set, and then I can call the set function because Corinna knows the difference between the two. So methods and functions will be different. If I import a function called blah, and I don't have a blah method, if I ask, can object can blah, it will say no because it's looking for methods, not subs. So it's going to be cleaning up a lot of stuff. Namespace auto clean won't be necessary anymore. Though, to be honest, this might not make it in the first version because there's a lot of stuff Paul's got to do in order to get this working. Debugging encapsulated objects. This is the biggest concern a lot of people have, and it's a very fair concern. So the meta object protocol will allow encapsulation violation. This gives us the ability to provide tooling available for data printer, data dumper, and other things to be able to say, okay, let me see the data of my object. And you get to choose what data gets exposed via that if you want to, rather than having all of it available if you need to keep something secret. And the benefit of that is you can still debug, you can still print out your object and see what's in there, but when your code's in production, people will be able to violate encapsulation, but they'll have to work at it by going through the meta object protocol rather than doing it by accident. And it will also make it much easier to show up on code reviews and you can say, hey, why are you doing that? So again, another huge win. I mentioned the RFC is huge, and you might be a little bit concerned by that, but Corinna is actually pretty simple. And part of the reason it's simple is because of this man, Damian Conway. He went through the RFC several times. He's given a lot of feedback, and a lot of it's been extremely helpful. And he realized that we're only providing 4 things: class, role, field, and method. That's it. Just 4 keywords. That's all Corinna is. And if you want to understand more about this, go out to blogsperl.org, check out Damian's blog, and he's got several articles explaining, what is being done and why it's being done and why he's so supportive of this. And you'll use feature class to be able to import this. And if you want to understand how Corinna works, perl.-f class or role or field or method, and everything associated with them is all in one space. It's going to be much easier for you to follow. But we also know those keywords aren't enough. And it turns out we have modifiers we can attach to various keywords. So my class is a other class. We do this via attributes. Or method propagate, comment. That makes it a class method instead of an instance method. What this does, I call this KIM syntax, keyword identifier modifier. It presents a clear, consistent way of defining everything. So it's predictable, and you can understand it very easily. And in fact, I would like to see a lot of the Perl language start adapting the keyword identifier modifier syntax, the KIM syntax, because it makes the language more predictable, more regular, and still keeps it Perl. I like the idea. I don't know how well that's going to fly. But January 16th of this year, the Corinna RFC was accepted by the Perl Steering Council. Corinna is actually going to be part of the core language. But there are caveats. Like I said, the RFC is huge. There's a lot of stuff packed in there. They wanted something smaller. What can we deliver in small incremental steps that can be better tested, that they can feel very comfortable about? Because, like I said, this is the biggest change to the Perl language in about 3 decades. It's huge. It's important. So we want to make sure that we're doing it right. So instead of an MVP, which had been planned, this is an MMVP, a minimum viable product, if you will. And Paul Evans is a person who's going to be implementing this. Most of you know him as Leonard. He's written the object pad module, which is on the cPanel now. This is a test bed for the ideas of Corinna, just to make sure that it works. So these aren't pie in the sky ideas we have. We actually have running code out there via object pad, which does this. It does have a few differences here and there. Plus, he's extending this, testing out other more radical ideas, like putting in async await, stuff like that, to make sure that we can actually compose all of this stuff and make it work brilliantly. And object pad is interesting enough that companies are using this in production now. And what I think is fascinating, he's done very little optimization on object pad. But despite that lack of optimization, it's running as fast as other OO systems. And one company reported about 10% less CPU usage as a result, which I think is fantastic. So if you're curious about this, go out there, check out object pad. I'm not sure that I would use it for production code. In fact, I probably wouldn't, because he's not guaranteeing the interface. Everything's subject to change, but it is available. And it's been a huge boon to nailing down a lot of what we need about Corinna. So what is the MMVP going to be? It's going to be released in 7 steps. The first one, I think, is 537. That's going to be classes, just bare classes with fields and methods. You won't even be able to set the fields at first. We're just testing out the core idea. So it's not going to be really useful for people. But this gives us something to start writing tests against. And part of what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be writing tests and doing my best to submit pull requests to P5P, to the Perl core, to say, hey, here are a bunch more tests for this, and I'm going to do everything I can to break it. Well, my job is to be a path of destruction instead of creation at this point, because I want to make sure that it's solid. After classes, he's going to be implementing inheritance, and then roles, field modifiers, field initializer blocks, the mop, and then method modifiers. I believe when the first 5 steps are done, you're going to have something which is going to be the 80% that most OO systems have, but with a much cleaner syntax. And because it's built into the Perl core, it's going to be much more solid, much faster. Once it gets out to 7, that's when we're going to have something really interesting. But the first 5 is what the vast majority of people need. So it's a fantastic program here. And interestingly enough, in March, the Steering Council announced that Paul's actually got a sponsor for his initial work developing Corinna. Again, this is how much companies want Corinna in the core, because I work with a lot of clients, I've worked on a lot of big systems, and OO now is very, very frustrating. They want something solid and modern. But you're probably wondering, when are we going to get it? I don't know. It's been years designing this, and that's based upon years of prior work in Perl and other languages. We want to make sure that we get it right, that we don't get it right now, because screwing up on this would be bad. If we push it too far, too fast, and we make a terrible design decision, that we're going to be stuck with it. So we don't want to do that. We're not making any promises about the time frame. Which raises the other problem. You want a better OO. What do I do now? You have various options. You can still use Bless if you want to. That's fine. That's not going away. Moose and Moo are still fantastic options. Those are out there. You could give Object Pad a try. Again, I probably wouldn't use it in production code, even though other companies have. Because again, Paul's not promising that the interface is going to remain stable while he works on it. Or you can check out a new module I've released to the cPanel called Sawyer X Extended. I've had several other people, including Toby Inkster, Graham Knopp, another gentleman whose name escapes me right now, sorry, have been contributing to this. A number of others have submitted pull requests or submitted ideas. And what I have done is I wrote a long article about problems in OO programming that you typically see. And I've tried to design Sawyer X Extended so that it makes it easier to avoid those problems, or natural to avoid those problems. It has a very conservative use of modules. In fact, Sawyer X Extended is just sugar for moose, so the performance is fine. So you don't have to worry about some of the performance issues you get with some of those other systems. And because I've been conservative about the use of the modules, you can check it out and you don't have to feel like, ooh, I don't feel comfortable with that really strange thing that he's put in there. It's a safe system. Also, I was so concerned about making sure that this was solid. I finally learned GitHub Actions, and now I have a full Windows and Linux continuous integration available on GitHub. So anytime I make a push, if there's a problem, I find out very quickly. And like I said, it's on the cPanel. Part of the motivation for it, you know that I hate boilerplate. This is boilerplate. Here's a simple XY point class, that's it. But all those other things are put in there, kind of the standard boilerplate that I want to have when I'm writing an OO system, because I think they're really important. And in the tutorial, which comes with MooseX Extended, I explain why they're important. I go through that in great detail in a way that I cannot now, unfortunately. I don't want that boilerplate. If you see my test most module, you know that's one of the examples I have of let's get rid of boilerplate. So I don't want to have to write that. So now you don't. With MooseX Extended, that's all you have to write to get your XY point class and have everything that you need in order to ensure that it's safe. You might notice I use a postfix block like I do when I write my Corinna examples. In Corinna, the postfix block is unfortunately required because we want to constrain the scope in which those keywords are exposed so we don't break other code by accident. But it's not required for MooseX Extended. If you don't want to use a postfix block, you don't have to. So those are just my personal quibbles. Part of it is I add two new functions, param and field. They're analogous to has. Has is still available, and it is completely unchanged. You use has just like you did before, but param and field, first of all, param and field both default to is RO, so you don't have to write that anymore. It has types built into it also, so that's available for you. Param, those are simply required. You have to have them. If they do not have a default or they do not have a builder, they will be required in the constructor. And if you don't pass them in, your code will blow up. So that's very useful. Field is discouraged in the constructor. In fact, you cannot declare an init arg for a field unless it has an underscore leading it. To make it clear to people, this is an internal method, do not touch. Originally, field was forbidden in the constructor, but it was made clear to me that you have to actually be able to have some way of providing so that when I'm writing tests, if I want to pass in an instance of something from my test for testing purposes, very common, you can still do so. Dependency injection, look it up. So what this does is the developer working on your code can just scan through the params and instantly see what your intended interface is, which is kind of hard to do with Moose sometimes when you're going through everything because people don't put init arg undef on there. You can't easily see what is and is not intended to be put in the constructor. So this is a nice little feature for you. Also note, you don't need to make immutable at the end. You don't need to declare one. We take care of all of that for you. But you're saying, I don't like this feature that you provided. Okay, you can exclude it. If you don't like strict constructor, for example, if you try and use this with DBX class, it will break because DBX class does not like strict constructors. It will blow up on you. So you just exclude strict constructor. In fact, you can exclude just about everything. I've tried to make this as flexible as possible. This is also a great migration strategy. If you want to migrate from Moose to MooseX Extended, just use MooseX Extended and get rid of everything. Make sure it still runs. Because MooseX Extended is just a thin wrapper around Moose, it's completely compatible. You can also include some features you want. So includes are for features that I thought shouldn't be default, but you might want them. So we have async await in there. We have multi-methods in there. You can ask for those if you want them. So async await is from the async await modules that Paul Evans has released. So yeah, async await. Other stuff is great. We have attribute shortcuts, which I won't go into now. You can imagine what they are. Attribute cloning is interesting because here I've implemented cloning on a per attribute basis rather than an instance basis. So if I set a datetime object and I say I need you to be cloned, I can use a default cloning, which is a storable declone, or I can set methods for, or anonymous subs for setting up my own cloning. So I have fine-grained control of how I want the cloning to happen. And what happens then, whenever you set or get a reference, you get a clone, which means I can then change the reference and others do not have their references mutated. So you can create true read-only objects in a way that's very hard to do right now. But this is kind of frustrating because I've gotten rid of a lot of boilerplate for you, and I hate boilerplate, but I've added more boilerplate. Did I mention that I hate boilerplate? I decided I want this boilerplate to go away. So you use MooseX Extended Custom. By the way, all this stuff works for roles too. Use MooseX Extend Custom. You declare your own moose. You set up an import method, and you create your custom moose with, whatever excludes, includes, whatever you want. There's other stuff in there. And then in your code, you just use my moose, and it's simple. Your boilerplate is gone. Done. Because I hate boilerplate. I don't want to type that. I want to type working code for my clients and for me. So we try to have safe defaults in there. For example, the is read-only, MooseX strict constructor, stuff like that. It's almost 100% standard Moose code using Moose exporter, things like that. There's nothing fancy. There's no tricks going on under the hood. It does include the XS modules, true PM, and bhooks at runtime, because that lets you get rid of a true value at the end and the make immutable. Again, you can exclude those if you want to, but those modules are stable. They've been out there for many years and they're solid, so I feel very comfortable with them. And I try to apply best practices out of the box, and again, you read the MooseX Extended manual, the tutorial, and that will explain to you what those best practices are and why I feel they're important. And it's got a ton more. I won't go into it now, but ordinarily I'd be taking questions now, and unfortunately you're not here, or I'm not there, or something like that. That's awkward. I can't take the questions. If you want to email me, please feel free. I hope to see you at a future conference. I hope you're having a wonderful day, Houston. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.